Hi, everyone. Good evening. I am Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College, and I'm here tonight with Brad Schiller,
Hi, everybody.
founder and CEO of Prompt. So we're excited. I can see more and more people are showing up. I'm going to stream this to Facebook at the same time. And Brad and I were just talking. We've been doing this. I think this is like the fourth year.
Yeah, it's the third or fourth year. We're kicking it off again. This is this is the first one of these that we do.
It's the beginning of the season, kind of for essays. So completely understand how everybody wants to know more about what's to come for them and their students for the next few months about dealing with essays. Definitely a big topic. Definitely going to become a big part of your and your students' life for the next few months. So, and Brad has a ton of great information to help get people through it. So let me just give you a tiny bit of housekeeping. This is recorded. We send out the link tomorrow. So sometimes you may or may not, your student may not be with you here tonight, which is fine. But a lot of times people find that this is helpful to watch this with their student at another point. I so appreciate people who have put on their video. Even if more people want to put on your video, it's just nice to see a face as we do these presentations. And just if you can keep yourself muted, that would be ideal. Brad will be definitely answering questions. I'll be looking through the chat as things go and probably stop him with some questions, or we'll answer them at the end. And I think you'll get a lot of great information tonight. And Brad will then also talk to you about Prompt and how they work with students. And they've worked with a ton of students in general and a lot of students from the Road to College family. So we have a lot of great experience and a lot of good feedback from people who have worked with them over the past few years. So Brad, with that, I will spotlight you.
All right, I'm spotlighted. Here we go. Thanks, Debbie, and thanks for having me as always. So as Debbie mentioned, feel free to drop kind of into the chat any questions that you have kind of along the way. Debbie's monitoring that. She interrupts me relatively frequently because she knows everything that I talk about like the back of her hand. She could give this whole thing herself at this point. And so, if I'm forgetting to say something that she thinks is really important, she will also.
I will chime in.
Yeah, she will also chime in. The other thing that I would love to do is, drop to the chat. Number one, where are you from? And then number two, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried are you, not your kids, but you are about college admissions essays? 10 being extremely worried, 1 being not worried at all. Okay. So just go ahead and drop that in. We have numbers that are kind of all over the place, lots of 10s, 8s, 7s, 9s.
Yeah, I was going to say this.
Honestly, the couple folks in like the 4 or 5, I'm like, why are you here tonight? No, it'll be valuable for everybody. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We got lots of stuff to cover today. This is as I said, any questions that you have, please drop those into the chat kind of as we go. My name is Brad Schiller. I'm founder and CEO of Prompt, and we are the largest college admissions essay coaching company globally, working with thousands and thousands and thousands of students every single year. And so a bunch of stuff that we're going to talk about and cover today. One is the importance of these essays and to actually getting accepted. So we're going to talk about how colleges actually evaluate applicants and what do they look about? What do they look at? And this is really helpful and relevant regardless of, how much, kind of you're putting on the essays, just like to understand like exactly kind of how colleges are actually evaluating applicants. We're going to talk then about how to write essays that actually match with what colleges are looking for. So one of the things that we really frequently see is that students are actually writing about the wrong topics. They're writing about the wrong things because they don't understand what their audience actually cares about. Okay. And so we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. And that's really important for you helping your students. And it's the number one thing that we focus on with students is helping them build an understanding of their audience so they know what to write about. We're going to go through an actual example essay. We're going to take a look at a first draft and a final version of it. So you can kind of see the progression that a lot of students will go through, that we work with, but also, there's a massive change usually between a first and a final draft of what you'll see. And we'll talk a little bit about prompts, coaching, do a bunch of Q&A, all of that sort of stuff. But in general, the way that we look at this is that, every single student is very unique. And what you're really trying to prove to the college is, that you are a unique person. Your student's a unique person and they belong on that campus, right? They're going to succeed on that campus. We've over the years, we've coached over 30,000 students at this point, worked with hundreds and hundreds of Road to College families. We'll talk more about our coaching, but if for some reason you're interested in this as we're going, you can go to myprompt.com/road to college. Once again, that's myprompt.com/road to college during, before, after, whatever the session. There's discounts there available to Road to College members as well. And I believe that Debbie will drop that into the
Yep.
All right. So let's go and get started. What do admissions officers care about? Okay, so this is the key question when we're thinking about our audience. Like, how do they actually evaluate students? Okay. And the number one thing that they actually care about is that your student will succeed in college and after they graduate. Okay. So when they're looking at an application, they want to know that academically, your student's going to be successful on their campus. Okay. And then they also want to know and have a good feeling that your student is going to succeed on that campus also beyond academics. And then after they graduate, they want them to, ideally graduate in 4 years. That reflects well on the college. And then they ideally also want them to go get jobs. They want them to get jobs in all sorts of different areas, a lot of times all around the world. So that way they can have an impact on a lot of different things. And that reflects really well back on the school, right? Because then they tell their friends, you all say, hey, Sally, Debbie, everybody had a great experience at X college. And guess what? Then you tell your friends, and then they want their kids to also go to that college, right? So this whole thing around like success is really, really important, right? Success academically, success, within kind of the social constructs in the school community, success after graduation, all of that really, really matters to these colleges. So when they're looking at the application, this is what they're trying to evaluate. And so how do they do that? Okay. So they use this, what's called a holistic admissions process. And we'll talk about why they do that in a bit. But there's basically a few different criteria. One is they give your student an academic score. Okay. So they look at your student's grades. They look at the strength of curriculum. A lot of times, actually, the high school that they attend really matters a lot. So they actually look at, for example, if like 5 students have gone from that high school to their college in the past, they'll actually look at how those students from that high school did at their college, okay, academically, and did they graduate, that sort of thing. And then they look at any sorts of different test scores. So they kind of take all of that together, they have an algorithm, and they come up with a score, okay, and that's your academic score. Then there's what's called the personal score, okay. And so this is a little bit more amorphous, right? This is kind of going through the activities that the student did, but not just what the activities are, but actually how the student writes about the activities. How engaged were they? What did they actually accomplish within the activities, right? The essays, like what did the student write about and how did they write about it? Recommendations, and then maybe even an interview if applicable. Then on top of that, and these are things you can affect less, schools have other priorities like demonstrate what's called demonstrated interest. Okay. So some schools, like they want to know that there's a really high probability that if they accept you, that you're going to attend. Okay. Because that actually is what's called yield. So let's say they accept 2,000 students and only 1,000 attend, that's a 50% yield. Okay. The higher that number is, the higher their US News ranking becomes. Okay. So this is something that really matters to them, right? So actually demonstrating interest, like showing interest in the school. So they'll look at that. They might look at family income, first generation, geography, legacies, athletics, like all sorts of different stuff. Most of the stuff you can't affect too much other than continuing to demonstrate or change, other than continuing to demonstrate interest in a school at this point. But just kind of want to give you the lay of the land that there's like a lot of different things that admissions officers are considering, for, and a lot of this does not necessarily have to do with the merit of your student and whether or not, they deserve it from like a merit perspective over somebody else. Okay. These are just kind of all the different considerations that they have. So the easiest way to think about this is you get an academic score and you get a personal score. Okay. The higher both of those scores are, the more likely you are to get in. All right. It's pretty simple. The couple of really important concepts here. One is what's called the academic bar. Okay. So once your student is above the academic bar, that school believes that your student will academically succeed at that college. Okay. Once you're there, you're pretty much good. Yeah. The higher you are, the better. But that means that they're willing to accept you. Okay. When you're below the academic bar, it's usually they will not accept a student. Okay. And so they're measuring that. Once again, they're looking at grades, they're looking at strength of curriculum, they're looking at test scores, they're looking at all these different things and kind of combining that together. Okay. And we're going to actually take a look at like how many students are in these different categories in a second. And then there's also something called the personal bar, which is, okay, if you're score too low on the personal score, that it's basically like so few students are below the personal bar, but it basically is like, as you're reading through an essay, you're like, wow, this kid is like stealing stuff, or like just like actual character flaws, like in the students or recommendations. Okay. So like, it's very rare. It's like, a couple tenths of a % of students might be in that category. But that also is something to understand. Okay. So general gist of it is, mostly the academic score is kind of figured out, or you're getting close to that at this point. But the personal score, this is where the essays come in, you can have a significant and substantial impact on.
So Brad, I recently read, this was an admissions officer kind of explaining their process, that academic bar, also kind of determines how much time they're going to end up spending on the rest of the application. Yes,
that's correct, right? So if you think of like a very large school, they basically will they take everybody's application, all the numbers, and they run it through their algorithm, and then that spits out what their academic scores are. And then people with the highest academic scores, they actually don't spend that much time on, because they might just get, they kind of read the application and they might get admitted, like at a Georgia Tech, for example, which is an awesome school. But they just have a lot of applicants, right? And they accept a lot of students. And then you also have students that are so far below the academic bar, they're going to look at, most of these schools still want to look at the essays and that sort of thing, but they might spend less time. It's the students that are kind of in the middle, right? Where they spend the majority of their time. Okay. And so, the way to kind of look at this, is let's actually take a look at the data. And this is really, really important. Okay. For everybody here, which is that strong academics are usually not enough, especially at selective institutions. Okay. And this data that we're looking at is from 2015 to 2019 for Harvard, actually, because they had to publicly release their data because there was some court cases recently, which I won't discuss, but we had to get all of their data. And I read through like hundreds and hundreds of pages of it and kind of consolidated all of like the key learnings together. But this is really important, which is that roughly speaking, 4 in 5 applicants to a school are actually above their academic bar. Okay. So students, like when you're thinking about, hey, where do I want my student to apply? You're looking at grade point average. You're looking at, maybe test scores if you're not applying test optional. And you're kind of determining, hey, where do I think, I fit, or the student fits, my student fits academically. Okay. And what you find is that kind of across the board, 4 in 5 students are above the academic bar at most of these schools, meaning that school feels that student could be successful at that school. Okay. You know, and this is where things get really difficult, because if you look at a school, you know, I'm only using Harvard as an example just because I have the data, right? But they get 60,000 applicants a year. That means about 50,000 applicants. They believe, hey, we could accept 50,000 applicants and they'd all probably be academically successful here. Okay, but they only accept 2,000. All right. So how are they differentiating students? Number one is obviously people with stronger academics. Sure, why not? That's helpful. But what you find is that, you know, that's still a huge population of students. Okay. And so what they're doing is that this is where the personal score comes in. All right. And so what's really interesting is that only 1 in 5 applicants have strong personal scores. Okay. And how are students differentiating themselves in the personal score? It's not just the activities that they've done. There's a lot of students have done a lot of different activities, but it's actually what have they done and accomplished in the activities or outside of the classroom, on their own, that sort of thing. And it's really what you write about and how you write about it, you know, across your essays, maybe a portfolio that the student may need to do, the activities list, like how are they writing about them on the activities list or in the additional information section. This is critical. Okay. And it's so important that essentially when you look at the data and you're looking at strong academics versus so strong academics versus sufficient academics. If you have a strong academic profile, you'll have a 3x improvement in admissions chances. But when you have a strong personal score, you have a 10x improvement in admissions chances. Okay. So this is a really critical element in understanding. It's like a huge part of this is really like how are you kind of writing about the things that you've done or accomplished? Okay. So that's kind of the general gist of it. Okay. So we're going to talk a little about when essays matter and kind of when they don't. Okay. Because they do matter more for some schools than for other schools. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the number of essays that you're going to need to write, because that's kind of a shocking piece of information that if you have not had a student go through this process before, it could be a lot. It can be overwhelming. So we're going to do that. And then we're going to get into like what to write about. Okay. All right. So essays matter more for like what we call like highly selective colleges. So these are under a 15% admit rate. And the number of these colleges keep increasing because basically post COVID, the number of applications per student have been going up substantially. So you actually see admission rates at many institutions going down because the applications to them keep going up. Essays can also really matter for selective colleges where your students' academics are like sufficient, but they're not necessarily in that strong category, right? So if you're applying to Georgia Tech, you have really strong academics, your essays may not matter that much because you might get in. You're probably going to get in with really strong academics. But if you're kind of, you know, above the academic bar, but don't have really exceptionally strong academics, that's where the essays start playing a much more important role. Okay. They also matter to large colleges where you're applying to highly desirable programs, okay, especially like computer science or engineering, STEM related stuff, or desirable like out-of-state colleges. So if you're out of state from and applying to University of North Carolina, that tends to be more important from like an essay standpoint because they only take a more limited number of students from outside of the state. If you're applying to the University of Washington, in Washington State, and you're applying for computer science, that's an extremely competitive program. Okay. And so in those cases, like essays can matter quite a bit more than maybe applying to other majors at that institution. Okay. Essays matter less, you know, for kind of selective colleges where your academics are strong. We just talked about that. And then also larger colleges where you're applying in state or applying to less competitive programs. Okay. That's the gist of it. All right. Essays could still play a role in, you know, like, you know, if it's like an honors college program, you know, that they tend to be pretty important, especially if it's like a fairly selective program, or for certain scholarships that schools may have as well, right? So not just necessarily the major you're applying to, but also that piece of information. Okay. Great. All right. So let's talk about how many essays you're actually going to write. Okay. So you're applying to less selective colleges, you might not need to write any essays, or you might need to write just one, which is typically the common application essay. You're going to write maybe an activities list and different information section. And that might be it. But some of the schools may have what's called supplemental essays, so extra essays that they want you to write. And there might be a couple of those kind of across all the schools that you're applying to. But when you start moving up the spectrum in terms of how selective or the lower the admissions rates are for colleges get a little excited, right? They're like, hey, we have a lot of people that might want to apply here. We're just going to start asking more questions, right? We want more information about the student. And so in those cases, you'll start seeing what's called these supplemental essays. So these extra essays that you need to write, okay? Some schools have one, like Cornell, for example. They have a, hey, why are you applying to this particular major at Cornell? And it's like 500 or 650 words or something like that. And that's one essay. But then you have other schools like Columbia that have like 7 or 8 shorter essays, right? Stanford has a bunch of essays. I think University of Michigan, I think, has 3 essays, a couple of, usually 250 to like 400 words or so in length. So all these schools have, different essays, and sometimes they change per year. But the key is like, hey, if you're applying to some selective colleges, you might be writing 5 to 20 essays. And if you're applying to a bunch of highly selective colleges, like some students are applying to like 4 or 5, maybe in the Ivy League or Ivy equivalent colleges. Some of those students are writing 20, 40, 60, 80 essays. Now, sometimes there's overlap in those essays, and you can use the same one for different schools, multiple schools, which you can do for the common application essay. But schools are not that nice, right? So one school might say, hey, I want a 250-word essay on this one topic. And the other school will be like, hey, I want a 150-word essay that's kind of on the same topic, but it might be slightly different, right? So you have to modify these different essays for these different purposes based off of what a particular college is looking for, which is what we're going to talk about in a bit. But that's kind of the gist of it, or the lay of the land. So if you haven't gone through this process yet, depending on where your student's planning on apply, you may not have that much work to do here, or you may just have like a huge quantity of work to do. That could be, 30, 50, 80 hours of work for your student, or more, like over months at a time. Okay. Debbie, have there been questions that have come in, or thoughts that you've had that you want to go through before we kind of like get into the meat of what colleges are looking for? I think are you on mute?
Sorry. The only thing I was going to say is, I don't know if you want to mention kind of like when colleges kind of let you know when the essays are available, how you might be able to find them on the prompt platform.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that.
Okay.
So like, yeah, what's cool about our platform that Debbie's referencing is you just kind of input the list of schools that you're applying to, and we will give you all the essays that you need to write, including all the optional essays. Because what happens sometimes is there's certain essays that if you're applying to a certain program at a school, or an honors college at a school, or certain major, you might have extra essays to write, or scholarships, for example, you might have extra essays to write for those institutions. And usually colleges are starting to kind of few will release some of their essays in May or June, and then they start kind of announcing more into July. And then once the common application goes live, which is August 1st, the vast majority of colleges have their essays out, with the release of the common application, essentially. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we find that students tend to have the most success, with being really confident in their essays, being able to spend enough time on their essays, being really confident in the applications they're submitting, by getting started over the summer and getting the applications for their top 1 to 3 choice schools done before their senior year starts. Okay. So that way they can concentrate on enjoying their senior year, all the activities they're doing, their classwork, all that sort of stuff. Rather than having to worry so much like their friends are going to worry about, like, getting all the essays done, etc., because you don't want to kind of skimp on some of the work here, essentially. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. We'll take a look at the prompt system and which is cool because it's free for you to use as well.
Sorry, Brad, quick question. Somebody is asking, do colleges reuse their essay prompts year to year?
Some do, some don't. Sometimes a college will have the same one for 2 or 3 years and then they'll change it up. There's, generally speaking, of all the essay prompts across all colleges, there's about a 30 to 40% turnover a year. So about, 56, 60, 70% will be the same, essentially. Okay.
And kind of related to the same, somebody's asking, where can they find the essay prompts for individual colleges? They're saying they thought they had to wait until the Common App was live.
Yeah, so you can do that and wait till the Common App is live. We track kind of all the announcements that different admissions departments make, so we actually include that in our own system. I'll just show everybody really quick because we're on this. But basically, we have we have this system, and you can use our essay coaching or not, or you can just create a free account. And we have this thing called My Schools. You can type in the schools that you're applying to, for example, and you can add that school. I think I already have it probably on here as well. You can add a school. You can select and this kind of helps you manage that whole process. So, for example, if I'm applying to the University of Michigan, I can actually see all of the essays that I need to write. You can see here, this is from last year. So otherwise it would say current because they haven't announced them yet. But what you can also do is you can see all the extra essays that you need to write or may need to write. So in this case, if I want to apply to the Ross Bachelor of Business Administration program, I'll actually have a couple of extra essays to write, or and that sort of thing. And then you can see all the required essays here as well. And so this students tend to find really helpful. If you haven't tried to use the Common Application before with other students, it's kind of a mess. And so a lot of times, based off of different questions that you answer in the application, extra essays may appear. And a lot of students that we know, when they're, or that we've heard, right, when they're actually submitting their application, usually about 90% of all applications are submitted within 48 hours of the deadline. And a lot of times students are going through, that's the actual data from the Common App. When you actually go into it, so students will be filling it out, and they'll fill out something, and then a new essay will pop up that they never even started writing, and they're like, oh shoot, now I have 1 hour to write this new essay, right? And that doesn't go over super well. And so the important part is what's nice is we're tracking all of that information, so you actually have everything in a full list of everything that the student needs to do. And we even actually help students kind of figure out, our system helps students, when I click here, I can actually base this essay on another essay I've written, and I can actually recommend we recommend other essays, so you can actually see kind of connections between essays that might be on similar topics, for example. And that's all within our system. And when we coach students, that these are all the tools that we're using, but it's also, you can just create a free account at myprompt.com/road-to-college. You can create a free account as well, and get access to all of this as well.
Brad, one other quick question maybe before you go on, which I think is interesting. So somebody was asking kind of the ages of the admissions officers to kind of get a sense of who the audience is. So I don't know. Who's really going to read the essays?
Yeah, it's funny because it's kind of a mix, right? But the easiest way to think about it is for your student to imagine themselves in approximately 5 to 8 years from now, right? So after they've graduated. Okay, so a lot of the admissions officers, and especially depending on which school, I mean, it varies by schools, but a lot of the admissions officers are fairly young, recent graduates, especially of that institution. And they're not necessarily the dean of admissions, but they're the ones that are, out recruiting students. They're the ones engaging with students. They're the ones reading the applications and doing the first passes on the applications. And so, from an audience perspective, it's usually imagine your student in, 5 to, 10 years or so, right? That's kind of the sweet spot for where a lot of the application readers are. It's a bit different for let's say the University of California system because it's so large. They have just like a huge network of just admission readers that come in and score all of the essays that then get sent to the admissions departments at each of the campuses. So that one's a little bit different because you end up with a lot of people of all sorts of different age ranges. But you also have to think about the dean of admissions, because very likely it's not like, so the process isn't, oh, one person reads the application and makes the decision. Okay, that's usually not how it works, right? What happens is usually two people read the application, and then they might discuss that application and give it a score. Then they'll take the applications that have certain scores and they will go to a committee and discuss them. So, you know, the assistant dean of admissions or the dean of admissions, like these people are involved in actually reading the applications as well, right? So you need to kind of consider both, you know, ends of the spectrum, right? So you can't just, you know, use the language that the kids are using these days and, expect the, maybe the admissions dean may or may not, understand it as well, right? But part of this is like, just in terms of how you're writing, that sort of thing. We're going to talk a lot about writing style and that sort of stuff. Really matters a lot, kind of understanding like who is the type of person that's reading this. Because a lot of times you read, for example, a big myth is like, oh, I need to use really large vocabulary words to sound intelligent. Okay. And that is completely false, because if your kid is not going to know that vocabulary word and use it in their everyday language in about 5 or 6 years from now, don't assume that the person that had recently graduated at school is also going to understand what that word is. And so if they're reading and they come across a word and don't immediately understand it, they're not going to look it up. They're just going to be like, why is this word here? Right? They're just not going to understand what they're trying to say or read, right? And so it's really important. Yes, like what we call lexical resource, which is like using a variety of words or sometimes more complex words, can be useful, but it all has to be words that are typically in people's lexicons, right? Like their normal vocabulary, right? Where they can read something and very easily understand it. Okay, and that goes for writing style as well, which we'll talk a bit about. Okay, cool. Let's go. Let's talk about what colleges are and aren't looking for in essays. So remember, like the entire purpose of this college application is to prove that your student will succeed in college and after they graduate. All right. So what does that mean? And what's great about this is like by attending the session tonight, you and your student will already have like a substantial advantage. Okay. Because most people think that essays are about telling your story, okay, or telling your student's story. All right. And so in that vein, and by the way, admissions officers perpetuate this myth. Many counselors perpetuate this myth, or teachers, or all sorts of different people perpetuate this myth because it's not wrong. Okay. It's just incomplete, because really essays are about telling your story that proves you'll be successful in college and beyond. So you need to specifically focus on stories that will actually show that you're more likely to be successful. Okay. So writing a story about, how you've been afraid to clip your toenails since you were 5 years old is not going to prove that you're going to be successful in college and beyond. I'm only using that example because that's an actual essay that I
was just going to say, people might think that that's a bizarre story, but I know.
Yeah, I know. It's actually like it exists, right? Because how could I make something like that up? And like, these are the types of things that a lot of students feel like they should be writing about, but guess what? It doesn't prove that they're going to be successful in college and beyond. So how do you make that proof? And what it really comes down to is that there's 5 traits that colleges look for in applicants. So this is one that I know Debbie will send out. This is like the #1 thing that people screenshot or take pictures of or whatever in this entire presentation. I see some cameras out.
Yep,
right now. This is the thing that you talk to your students about. This is the thing that we work, talk to every single student that we coach, about, and it's these 5 things. And I'm going to talk about each of them really quickly and why colleges love these types of students, or why this is like a trait that colleges will find successful. So the first one is drive, right? So these are students that, whenever they're in a challenging or difficult situation, they are kind of getting through it, right? But not just getting through it, they're actually identifying ways to make their situation better. They're solving problems along the way, and they're coming out of this whole thing a better person, right? So no matter how long the odds are to succeed or do something, they're driven, they're pushing themselves through. Okay. A bunch of colleges got together a number of years ago to discuss different traits and that sort of thing. And, the people that were at that conference, they were like, hey, we're just going to call it grit. Okay. I prefer drive, but it's the same concept, the same thing, right? People that are really driven, schools like this because they know that when your student is on campus, they're going to encounter a challenging situation at some point. Okay. And what do we talk about? They care about students succeeding, which means graduating. All right. And so if a student's that driven and they come across a challenging situation, they are maybe more likely to not graduate or to drop out. Okay. So this is really important. They want students that are really driven. I was talking to the dean of admissions at MIT a number of years ago about the 5 traits. He's like, yep, drive is the one that matters the most to us. Okay. And he's like, I'm not just looking for driven students. I'm looking for students who are unusually driven. So in a pool of applicants, tens of thousands of applicants that are all really driven, who are the ones that set themselves apart as being even more driven than the really driven students? Okay. And how do you determine that? By what the students write, what the students write about and how they write about it. Okay. So that's one, drive. That's the single most important one. The second is intellectual curiosity. So these are students that love learning just for the fun of it in their free time to get a deeper understanding of subjects and topics of which they're interested in. This one, students miss all the time. Okay. But it's really important. And here's why, right? So students that are intellectually curious, when they select a major, when they select different things that they might do in college or in the future, they're just going to keep diving in deeper and learning more about it. Okay. There's so many students that are so intellectually curious right now, and they don't realize that colleges actually like their intellectual curiosity. They don't realize that, hey, that thing that they're, the music that they're writing or they're playing around with AI music these days or AI generated images or whatever it is, right? They're doing cool things or photography or, some kids are doing their own research or whatever it is. There's so many things that students are engaged with these days that involve self-learning outside of the classroom, and colleges love that. They want to know about that. And yet students almost to a T, when we talk to them, they will not identify this as something that they should be writing about. Okay. So this is really important. It's so important that at Emory, for example, they call their personal score when they evaluate applicants. They don't call it the personal score. They actually call it the intellectual curiosity score. Okay. Just to give you a sense of how important this is to a lot of institutions. The third is initiative. So these are students that are really entrepreneurial, never really willing to accept the status quo, always thinking of ways to improve whatever they're working on. Okay. So they're the ones that they're in a group of students, they're in a group of people, and they're like, this could be better. Okay. I probably see some of you nodding along. It's yep, this is my student, right? This could be better, right? And not only they're identifying how it's better, they're I'm going to make it better, right? So they're the ones that are taking actions. A lot of times they're the ones that are taking the lead, kind of, helping other students and accomplishing something in a group together. Okay. Obviously colleges really like students that take the initiative. They're the ones that are going to be the leaders on campus. They're the ones that are going to get stuff done. They're also the ones that after they graduate are going to become leaders and maybe, have an impact on the world in some way, or maybe make a lot of money and donate that back to the school, right? These are the things that they care about, right? In terms of student success. Fourth is contribution. So these are the students that no matter what group of people they're a part of, that group of people are far better as a result of that student being there. Okay. So colleges love these students because these are the connective tissue of the school's campus, right? So colleges realize that a huge part of their value is the school community, not just the education that you get, okay? And they want students to have a great experience, and they want them to have positive feelings about the school after they graduate, because those positive feelings end up meaning you tell other people, right, that then say, hey, Billy had a great experience at University of Michigan, and then, Sally, and now, Sally's parents found out about that, and now Sally wants to go to University of Michigan because of that, right? So this really matters. And so they want these students that are these uber contributors, these people that making everybody around them better. They're the connective tissue across the campuses, so they're looking for those. And then the fifth one is diversity of experiences, and also basically diversity of experiences and interests, right? So they want students that have a lot of different life experiences, different ways of thinking about the world, different interests. These are all kind of unique perspectives that they can add to the student body, okay? And so this is really important. I'll give you an example, just because the data is kind of fascinating, is that at Harvard, and this was a number of years ago, so admission rates are now lower, they don't care supposedly about what major you're going to do, but they do ask, like, what do you want to do? Or like, what do you want to be, right? That sort of thing. And so if you want to go into medicine and you're going to Harvard, and this was a number of years ago, so the admission rate's lower, your admission rate was 4%. It's probably like 2% now, or 2.5%. Okay. But if you wanted to go to Harvard and you wanted to be an educator, your admission rate was like 11%. Okay. And it's all because, even at a place like Harvard, they're like, hey, we don't want every one of our graduates to go into medicine. And even at a place like Princeton, they're like, hey, we don't want every one of our graduates to go into finance, even if it seems like it, right? So these are the types of things that schools are looking for, even ones that don't necessarily have like you're not applying to a specific major, like you might be at, like one of these larger state flagship institutions. It still does matter, right? It still does matter in terms of your interest areas, your different things that you're looking to do. I'm not saying like, hey, if you want to go into medicine, say you want to be an educator, like that's not what I'm saying, right? On the application, be truthful, but it's helpful to realize that just like the different experiences you have, the different interests you have, that stuff really matters to them, right? Because they're trying to build, they're not actually trying to find well-rounded students as much as trying to build a well-rounded class of students that have like deep interest in a variety of different areas that those students could then like connect and collaborate on.
So actually, to that point, Brad, there were a few questions about, does the essay need to exhibit all 5 of these traits?
Yeah,
And
by the way, I keep this softball there for you, so you ask this every time, Debbie. So in short, right, you want to focus on 2 or 3 strengths, okay? Across all of the essays, you still want to focus like on 2 or 3 strengths. So when I was talking before about how at MIT they wanted unusually driven students, how do you prove that? Okay, well, you prove that by being driven in one situation, and then being also extremely driven in another situation, and in another situation. And so it's like no matter what you're doing, you're just like extremely driven and always solving problems and always getting past things, right? So hitting, basically just repeating the same messages in a lot of different kind of scenarios shows like a lot of strength. Now, a lot of times the examples like are overlapping, right? It's very easy for an example that you're writing about or a topic you're writing about to show drive, and that might be the primary thing, but it might also be showing initiative or contribution or those other things, right? So it can expand across a lot of these, but what we want students to do is really focus in on like, hey, what are your 2 or 3 big strengths? And then kind of, really focus on the experiences kind of related to those. That tends to have the best outcomes. So what you don't want to do is be like, oh, I don't have an essay on contribution. Like, let me write an essay specifically about contribution, but you actually are leaving better content on the table by doing that, right? You don't want to do that. So a lot of students are like, hey, I need to write about community service just because schools like that. And guess what? Like some students will have a lot of great community service experiences, others won't, right? And that's okay. But what you don't want is to say, hey, like I, developed the cure for cancer and I don't write about that, so I can write about my 2-hour community service experience on Saturday. Like, don't do that, right? Is the answer, okay? All right, other things here, Debbie. This is always one that we spend a little bit of time on. So
yeah, if somebody's asking, I'd love to hear a summary of an essay that you read that really works. We're definitely going to get
yeah,
to
we're
that
going to get to that in
yeah.
like just a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
So
there's a question here, and I'm going to give it to you, Brad, but you decide, you might want to answer it, a little later on. But the question is about how do you think colleges are going to know whether or not a student has used AI to create their essay?
Yeah, I think what we'll do is we'll talk about that when we look at the example essay, because a lot of it's like literally word patterns and such, and we can talk about that. The answer is it's a little easier than you think it is to do. In general, the AI generated essays, unless you really know what colleges are looking for and how to prompt it to do things correctly, or what it's producing like very fluffy content. Okay, so in other words, like it's content that is not going to work as being a differentiator for the vast majority of schools out there. Okay, all right, because guess what, the content is what matters, not necessarily the beauty of the writing. Okay, and we will see that later.
And here's one other question, but I'm pretty sure you have a slide later that talks about this. How much help should we as parents give our kids in writing their essays?
I mean, in short, don't write it for them.
Well,
but I mean, here's the thing, right? So if you have a really good understanding of what colleges are looking for in essays, in applications, you can be helpful, right? So just after attending this session, you can be a lot more helpful for your students than you would have probably before. Okay, but it is really hard to help your student get to the next level of content that really differentiates themselves without having people that have like seen a lot of this. Okay, so your students like Aunt Gertrude, might be a great writer, but if they don't understand, the audience, it's going to be much harder for them to help, right? Or it might be harder for you to help, or a teacher or a counselor, those types of things, right? And so that's the thing that what's really helpful, like, and we'll talk more about our coaching later, but really helpful from like a coaching standpoint is we can read content, and that content might be really good, or those topics and ideas might be really good, but then we know what are the next questions to ask the student to actually make that if they were able to answer it, will make their content even stronger. Okay, and number one. And then number two is that the most important thing with these essays is making writing really concise. Okay, and the reason for that is that you are on a very limited word count. So you might have you have a 650 word common application essay, you might have a few other essays, so call it 1,500 to 2,000 words to basically talk about all of your most compelling things that you have done in a clear and concise way that somebody can really easily understand. And what we very frequently find is because students have been taught to say, hey, you need a 5-page paper, and the student's like, I have 3 pages of content, let me add 2 pages of fluff. Like, that is what they've been doing, right? They haven't been like, hey, I have 2,000 or 10,000 words of things I want to say, and I need to do it in 1,500 words. Okay, that's a much harder thing. And that is something that we have to work with students on a lot. That's something that you may be able to help your student with as well. But it is a challenging thing, right? And you need it's basically like, what are the editors of like the New York Times or the Washington Post or all the Wall Street Journal, like what are they doing, right? With like really high end journalists, like those are the types of things like to really like hone in and make that writing like clear and concise matters. Okay, and so this gets to this point, right, which is what matters: the content, the clarity, the readability, really important. Okay, so if you think about the average amount of time that an admissions officer spends on an entire application, so not just reading the essays, but looking at the school, the high school they went to, the grades, all of that sort of stuff, is 8 minutes. Okay, so that means that they need to basically, let's say it's just the common application essay, they're going to read in 1 to 2 minutes. And if they're confused, are they going to go back and read it like 2 or 3 more times to try to understand it? They may not. Okay. And so what really matters is clear content, very clear writing, and very readable. So because they're going to read it fast, they need to be able to understand it very quickly. Okay. And all like the creativity is nice, maybe beautiful prose, kind of nice, maybe a nice to have, not necessary. And when you look at examples of essays online, if your students are looking at that, or they're watching all these TikTok videos on like, hey, here's the essay that worked, You know why those are popular? They're popular because they're fun essays to read. But that's not necessarily the essay. That essay might, maybe that kid got into that school, but thousands of other kids also got into that school with an essay that's not nearly as exciting or compelling. They just have really good content presented in a very clear and readable way, and that was good. Okay, and we see that all the time, right? Because I mean, we work with thousands of students. We have huge numbers that get into all of the schools every single year. And if you look at like the essays that they have, you're like, this is a really strong, well done essay, but you're not like blown away with like beautiful creative writing and metaphors and, you know, all of that sort of stuff. Okay.
So kind of along that same theme, Brad, what about, there's some questions, what if my child hasn't done something amazing? You know, so they don't have this great experience to talk about in an essay. Does that matter?
Yeah, so what's really fascinating is that what accounts for, like, you may be thinking like amazing in terms of, oh, you know, like they build rockets and, you know, like, you know, set something into low Earth orbit or, you know, whatever it is, right? But in reality, there's a ton of situations where you could showcase just like incredible like contribution or initiative for like things that are, you know, maybe a little bit more benign, right? Or that sort of thing. So, you know, you see a lot of examples of, you know, students being able to, like, they're in a small group of students, they notice some being bullied, and they're like, they were literally able to solve that, you know, problem. That's like contributing in a significant and meaningful way. You know, you see a lot of examples of students like just self-learning and like diving into YouTube videos of different topics, or like on these like random Discord communities these days. So there's like all sorts of different things that are actually really compelling to colleges that are not something that you would be like, oh, that's, you know, this unbelievably amazing thing, right? And so those are the things that it's like, hey, you really need to identify these different moments or these different things, you know, relate to the 5 traits. The other thing I will say is like, you still have time, right? You're here earlier than most people are starting to think about working on essays, okay? And that's good, because there's now opportunities, let's say over the summer, to do things or do self-learning or do things that involve initiative, etc., that you can then write about in those essays later, okay? And that, I think, is a really important thing as well to understand, is like just starting to go through and starting now to go through and figure out, hey, what are the things that we can be writing about? And we do this a lot with students now. Even they have their first session with their essay coach. They're not even going to start their essay maybe for a couple more months, but we develop what's called an application plan, where we actually go through like all of their most compelling content, figure out what is the most compelling stuff that we're likely going to write about, and then can even have a discussion on like, hey, if you were able to go do these things, you're going to make your content even more compelling. Okay. And so that I think it could be really helpful from a strategic standpoint. And the other thing I'll just mention is that there's no such thing as a bad topic, provided it relates to one or more of these 5 traits. A lot of times you see students are like, hey, I shouldn't write about, you know, band, or write about sports, or, you know, those types of things, because a lot of people do it. Okay. And the answer is, well, that's true that maybe you shouldn't write about those things like choir and orchestra, or, you know, the time that you know, tore your ACL and needed to recover. There's a lot of students do write about that stuff, okay? But the reason why we're saying maybe you shouldn't write about it is because for most students, that's not that compelling. You know, they might not have done anything different than like a normal kid in that situation, okay? A lot of times we see something that's like, I like band because I love music, and that's essentially the essay, okay? But then you have other times that like, the students in band and they, you know, have like their entire section of clarinets, and like there's a bunch of players that aren't very good, and they're like teaching them how to get better, and like, you know, and then they're doing like this ensemble, and now they're like, you know, went to you know, perform at some random place like down, you know, that sort of like a concert, and set it up themselves. That's completely different, right? And so now I have a lot of students that tell me, it's like, oh, I don't want to write about that because it's band. It's like, well, is it really about band, or is it actually about taking the initiative? Right? Is it actually about contribution? It's like, well, it's actually about those other things, right? So the point is like, you can have these like great setting, what I call like a setting, right? But the topic is actually about something that's related to one of the 5 traits, and that could be really compelling. So I just want to mention that, because we get a lot of questions like, is this a good topic, or is this a good topic? And undoubtedly, every time I answer that question, I'm like, well, let's think about how we can relate it to one or more of the 5 traits. Did you do X, Y, Z? You know, did you do A? Did you do these other things? And a lot of times the answer is yes on one of those things. And then they're like, well, this can actually be a really good topic for an essay. Because not all students have like, you know, band might really be their thing. So let's like identify like what within that construct, you know, is the most compelling thing for them to write about.
So along those lines, Brad, there's I've been a few questions kind of related to topics, and I'm just going to kind of throw out 2 categories. One is, should students write anything about maybe mental health issues that they might have dealt with? And the second is other issues maybe related to more like sensitive topics like LGBTQ or, you know, things like that, that they might, you know, feel like they may or may not, I don't know, you know, like maybe politics, something that may have the potential to offend, you know, a reader.
Yeah. So once again, it's like, consider your audience. Okay. Consider what are they looking for? Number one is they want students that are going to be successful in college and beyond. Okay. So when you're writing stuff about anxiety, depression, learning disabilities, etc., you have to look at it from the angle of, is somebody reading this going to believe that my student's going to be successful in college and beyond based off of what they're reading? Okay. And the answer then is that for some students, they're writing about this topic because it's a journey of personal growth. Okay. And so they've like dealt with a lot of challenges. They've gotten past a lot of things and are really like succeeding in a lot of ways right now. So, you know, especially like reading a lot of stuff with students with learning disabilities and having to like figure out different ways that they're going to actually like engage right with content and with the classroom and ultimately succeeding in a lot of ways. And guess what? When you're overcoming a challenge in a substantial way, that shows drive, right? And so college is like that. But a lot of times we see essays where students are writing about stuff because they're like, hey, I need to tell my story. But it's a story where you're like, okay, so if I accept this student, it's unclear if they're going to be successful or not. Okay, so they might want to accept the student, but they don't want to take the risk. Okay. So that's one. And so you have to be very careful about.
So it's all in the positioning.
Yeah, it's like the positioning, but it's also like, be truthful. Like, where are you actually at, right? And so if the answer is like still in the throes of a lot of stuff, okay, maybe don't write about that. Okay, so that's one. The second is like when you talk about like more kind of sensitive topics, just around where politics, those types of things, kind of may or may not get involved. Okay. That is something you also need to think about substantially in terms of, okay, who is my audience? Okay. So for, you know, the vast majority of institutions, you know, writing about LGBTQ plus in some way, shape or form, especially if, you know, maybe supporting the community or identifying in the community, that sort of thing, the vast majority of admissions officers are gonna be like, great, awesome, you know, sign me up type situation. Okay. Because that's just the audience they are. There might be a few schools where that may not be true. Okay. And you might be able to identify those. I won't name names. All right. The second thing then, so that's great, right? Now, when you're talking about politics, that also is a thing, right? And so the challenge there is, you know, many schools are like, hey, I want to have a lot of different viewpoints. But the admissions officers tend to, at a lot of these schools, have very similar viewpoints. Okay. So, you know, I try to say, hey, let's stay away from stuff that's just like you opining philosophically on random different situations in the world, because guess what? That doesn't actually prove that you will be successful in college and beyond. It just doesn't. Okay. Because you saying it's like, hey, you know, I am, you know, in favor of XYZ thing. It's like, well, okay, you saying that, but like, how is that kind of change? Like, how is that proving that you're driven or, you know, taking the initiative or intellectually curious or any of that? Now, you may find that a student's like very interested in politics and they're like actually out there like on the campaign trail with like local candidates. That's something cool to write about, right? Because it doesn't matter like what political party that's involved with. You're actually kind of writing about the actual like learning process of like, what have you, what are you doing to help some candidate, like going around knocking on doors, talking with people, that sort of thing. And so you're showing like contribution and like drive and maybe intellectual curiosity, diversity of experiences and interests. Like you're showing a lot of different things, right? So you have to think about it from the perspective, everything, as I said, goes back to, is this going to prove that I'm going to be successful at college and beyond? Does this relate to one or more of the 5 traits? That's what you have to identify, right? And if you look at every topic from that perspective, you can pretty easily then determine whether or not it's something you should consider writing about. All right, cool. Okay, the other thing, really important. We talked about there's a lot of essays to write. Guess what? Every single one of those is important. If the school is asking about it, they care. Okay. A huge part of the time, we find that students are spending huge amounts of time on their Common App essay, and then it's like a day before their application's due, and they come in and write those extra supplemental essays, and it shows. I was doing an event a couple of years ago with the former now Dean of Mission at University of Richmond. He's like, yeah, when I'm reading through the application, I just know if they wrote that extra supplemental essay like the night before. It's just obvious, right? It's not structured as well. There might be grammar mistakes. It's not as well like thought out, put together. He's like, well, do I think that student actually cares to be at my school? That was his viewpoint. He's like, I don't know, right? Are they just kind of submitting the application? He's like, so that was a signal to them that maybe this should be, a student that they don't want to have it on campus. Okay. Not to mention every single piece of content you're submitting kind of is actually put together in a single, like coherent personal, story and notes on an application and that personal score. It's not like they're like, oh, the student got a 10 out of 10 on their common application essay. Great. They got a 2 out of 3 on their supplemental essay. I'm going to add those scores up. That's not how it works. Okay. It's not like they're giving substantially more weight to the Common App essay or the activities list or whatever. They're looking at this holistically. Okay. So every single part of what you are submitting really matters. Okay. And so that is the other thing that I'll mention here. And that's another reason why starting earlier really does matter. Okay, so in terms of like, what should you do or how should you be looking at this? And it's great that you're all here now. And you can get started on this stuff earlier. And like how we work with students is like, okay, number one thing is like, goal is like start now planning your content you're going to use across your applications. Okay, identifying what has your student done that relates to one or more of these 5 traits and building that out. That's really helpful for also identifying what can that student do or engage with over the summer to even strengthen their content and their applications. Then you start with the common application essay. Typically we usually start that in June or July. Get that done. Okay, that's usually the essay that most students stress about the most. Then we want to complete the top application for the top choice school. Usually doing that in July or by early August. Okay. Once you've done the first school, the other schools become easier, okay, or less stressful. And you really want to be confident in doing that. There's also in certain situations, like if you're in Texas and you're applying to the University of Texas, Texas A&M, those types of schools, you actually want to submit your application much earlier than the deadline, okay? Because of how the whole thing is structured in terms of like how they read applications and accept students, etc. You actually want to get them in early. There's some other examples like that, but that's the one that usually is top of mind. Then you want to complete your applications for your next top 2 choices. So you're working kind of application by application. And you want to do ideally the applications of your top 3 choice schools by the time senior year starts. If you've done that, you will just have a wonderful senior year. Okay. Because this is like the last year that you are like, or ideally the last year that your student is like with you like all the time, right? Until maybe they move back after they graduate, right? If we're all so fortunate. And so my point here is that, don't be at like, butting heads over this. A huge part of what we're doing with students is literally holding them accountable and making sure that they're getting the work done. Because the last thing you want to do is just keep, nagging, I don't want to keep nagging Debbie like, hey, Debbie, you work on that? Did you work on that today? Right? You done with that? That sort of thing. You don't want to be doing. Okay. And so, we actually have people that, our system automatically nags students. We have deadlines, we nag students, or nudge students is what we call it, to get stuff done. But this is really important. Like the more work you can get done before senior year starts, the better. And then we just kind of work application by application. A lot of times students get very stressed out during the semester. They're like, hey, I've done, a bunch of applications, or I care a little bit less about this other school, so I'm not going to want to put as much effort in. Like, that's okay. You want to make sure they put the effort in on their top choices, or at least your top choices, right, for them, and make sure that they get that done, and that you actually meet like the early application deadlines, because those also have higher probabilities of getting in, for example. And then you can just relax, right, wait for those acceptances to roll in. So that's kind of the ideal process. As I said, getting started now in a very limited way. It's not like you need to write a bunch of stuff, but really starting to think through what are those things that you're going to be writing about. That's what we do with students, either this month or just after APs, that sort of thing, and just get students started and kicked off.
And I would, think that a lot of parents, just from, life, that the better you plan something, the easier it actually is when it comes time to do it. So I think that as much, the better, when I say planning, like the more time that you and your student can think about what are the things that you want to highlight, like what's the approach that you want to take based on the 5 traits. That's kind of, that will really, if you and your student, feel comfortable about what that approach is, when it comes down to writing and putting words on paper, it becomes so much easier.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm going to do the example in a bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about our coaching, and then we'll go through an example essay. So if people want to drop, they can, but it's an eye-opening, really valuable experience. So I highly recommend it. But just like a real quick introduction to our coaching, our goal is like, hey, we want your student's application to really stand out, right? We want the admissions officer, as they're reading it, to be like, oh yeah, this is it, right? This is the one. And so that's kind of the goal right here. And so, we're the highest rated, most recommended application essay coaching company. 98% of the students we work with get into at least one of their reach or target colleges. We play zero role in selecting what colleges you're applying to. So, we have students that are applying everywhere. 3 and 4 of the students that we work with get accepted to one or more of their reach colleges. So these are ones that, where, they're above the academic bar, but, it's kind of very hit or miss whether or not they're going to get in. We have acceptances to literally every top institution every single year, a bunch of them. We have a lot of high schools, actually over 250 high schools actually recommend our services. We talk about pricing in a bit, but we're half the price or less generally of comparable options. And we're able to do that because we're working with so many families and students in a really significant and meaningful way. And then we also just have a bunch of free resources for students that, are for example, families that are unable to afford, what we're doing. You can actually sign up for boot camps and send your students through these boot camps that we have. And if you attend the boot camps, the students also get like 2 reviews of their Common App essay, for example, as well. So we do that. We have an entire writing center that has like over 100,000 words of content on this stuff, and which is really valuable as well. And I'll show you in a little bit in the system. We have some content there that you can even go through with your student that can be really helpful. Just in terms of like what are we delivering, or like why, kind of how we look at coaching, and this is, I think, really important kind of as you're thinking about working with your student, or whether or not you want to work, have them work with a coach in some way, is that, the biggest things that we're focused on are really compelling content, really clear writing, and holding your student accountable to actually get the stuff done. Okay. And so a big part of that is developing your students' personal brand. So like, which of these traits are really their strengths? Like, what are we trying to drive home, right? What are the interest areas that we really want to focus on? Identifying what to write about for every part of every application. Okay. Also really important. making your students' ideas concise and compelling. Okay. As I was talking about, a lot of times we see students, they're like, hey, I wrote this, like, I couldn't figure out, like, I can't write my Common App essay in 650 words. So like, here's 800 words of it. And it's like, great. You know, those 800 words, you could have said all of those 800 words in 350 words. Okay. And now you have an extra 300 words of content that you can include, right? And those are the types of things that are so important here, because you're on such a limited amount of space to share all of the most compelling things, you know, about the
And
student.
along those lines,
Yeah.
Brett, somebody asked much earlier, is it okay to not use up all the words? You know, in the
Oh yeah, that's fine. But I would say, what?
I would say use it up, because just what you're saying, every word is an opportunity to get across.
Nearly every student we're working with is probably within 5 words of the maximum, right? Like on almost every essay. Okay. And so you know, a huge thing that we find, like, student, you know, as we get close to being done with students with essays, they're like, hey, you know, it's a 250 word essay. They're like, I'm at 270 words. I can't figure out, like, what are the rest of the words to cut. And so, you know, our coaches are going in like, hey, here's a bunch of options for you, right? And then the students go in and decide, like, how to do it, but we're actually teaching them how to write more concisely. So one of the things that we see, which is really fun, the thing that we founded this company focused on improving writing skills, right? And so we get students all the time and parents all the time that tell us, you know, the student will say, I've learned more in working with my writing coach about how to improve my writing skills or be a better writer than I have in all of my years of all of my English classes. Okay, that's a common comment that we have. We have parents that are like, hey, you know, I was reading my kids' work actually in their other classes, and it's like gotten way better, right? Their writing, you know, and like, they ask their student why, and they're like, oh yeah, you know, I'm working with my writing coach, and like I'm learning a lot just about that as like a skill, which is a critical skill, right, in college and then in life. So that in concise writing in a really compelling way, in a really structured way, in a very readable way is really important, right? So making every writing clear. A huge thing that we commonly see is like, I read the first few sentences of a student's essay. I'm like, I have no idea what this essay is about. Okay. And if I'm doing that, imagine your admissions officer who's reading like hundreds of these a day is going to be like, they kind of lose focus, right? There's actually some data that shows that there's like the scores of applications are worse if your application is read just before lunch when somebody's hungry, for example. Okay, now you don't have any control over that, but like it actually happens, right? So you want this to be super clear, concise, compelling. And then the fifth thing is that holding students accountable, like getting the stuff done earlier. And a lot of times it's because students procrastinate because it's such a daunting seeming task for them. But when they're working with their coach, they're like, hey, we're aligned on exactly what we're going to write about. We have an outline what we're going to write about. A lot of times it's even, they have like the first few words, right? Or the first couple sentences for, let's say, their Common App essay. And they're like, now go forth and write this. And I want this draft within 24 hours, right? And it's like, you know, spend the next 45 minutes working on it. And students really do that. And because now they're like super excited. They know exactly what to do and they're executing. Okay, great. We have the perfect coach for your students. We are the top 2% of coaches. We get thousands of applicants every year. Everybody goes through a really rigorous training evaluation process. You know, we match your coach based off of kind of their target college list, their ambitions, their learning style, personality, that sort of thing. We match that up for you. We have well over 100, 150 writing coaches or so. You know, we have like 2 people that you work with. You have your writing coach, but you also have your student success manager. They're the ones that hold your student accountable, right? Make sure that they're getting stuff done on time. In terms of what we have these school packages. We also have stuff for just Common App essay or UCAS, University of California essay, which we'll talk about in a minute. But these are our most popular, which is we support you on 3 of your applications for 3 of your schools. So 6 applications or all of your applications. The biggest discount that we'll do is on all kind of every application for every school, which is an awesome choice if you're applying to a lot of like highly selective institutions. Really a value there. But a lot of families are like, hey, we have, 2 or 3 top choice schools. We're going to go, with 3 schools, and then they, work on the rest of the applications on their own, or they might upgrade later. So those, and the 3 school one is really, really popular, as well as the all schools, but those are kind of the 2 that the majority use. So we have these discounts. They're available through midnight Sunday. If you go to myprompt.com/road-to-college, you can get one of these. It's completely risk-free, satisfaction guaranteed. You'll get a full refund if you're not satisfied after your first coaching session. Okay. We really believe in what we're delivering. So highly recommend doing that. If you want to talk to somebody on our team, you can also at the website schedule a time for us to call you and chat about what your options are and kind of you and your students' needs. And as I said, all of this is, typically for students that are applying to, fairly selective, so selective and highly selective schools. So admissions rates, under 15%, 25%, that sort of thing, typically here. But we also do for common application, just the Common App essay, or just the University of California personal insight questions, just that application. And so, a lot of students that are like, hey, I know where I'm going to apply. I'm going to apply into, one of my state flagship institutions. I want to make sure that I have a really strong essay for that purpose. They're picking up like our common application essay package, and having a lot of success with that. I know we had a student last year that she picked that up, was applying to Mississippi State, was applying to the Honors College. She ended up getting into Mississippi State Honors College, full ride, scholarship. And I think they even mentioned something about how they liked her essays. So it's, in what they sent to her. So that's kind of the other option here. Also, you can start with that. You can also just get reviews of individual essays later. This is something that you can do, or the University of California has 4 350-word personal insight questions. So if you're just applying to the University of California, this makes sense as well. We do have another option that's not one-on-one coaching. You can see this on the website, where we do these small group, call it common application essay boot camps, which are $299, several hours, and done in small group settings. So a few students, up to, I think it's 5 or 6 students per group. And then you get 2 reviews of your essays from our writing coaches as well with that. But the vast majority of students are doing the one-on-one support, either the common application essay or University of Personal Insight questions, or working with us kind of across their applications. So happy to answer any questions, related to that. But we're now going to dive into, take a look at the first draft and final draft of an essay for a student, so you can kind of see the progression that students actually go through, and then talk about what colleges actually find compelling about these examples, and talk a little about writing style, all of that sort of stuff. But Debbie, were there any questions that have come up?
Honestly, I answered a lot, and I think between what you reviewed, I think most of it is covered. It would be good if you want to just do the sample essay.
Yeah, I'll do the sample essays. We're just going to read them, discuss them, and then we'll wrap up. And if there's any questions, I'll stick around, and feel free to drop those in the chat, and Debbie will provide those. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and we'll dive in. So this is what I call the burrito essay. This is a student that worked with actually many years ago, I think 2015. And she ended up at University of Michigan, which was where she was from. I think in one of their very very awesome programs. I think it was, I forget which scholars program it was, but she also had gone into a bunch of other schools. She applied to University of California, Berkeley. She had got into I think UPenn, a lot of different options, but she went for the in-state tuition, and I think she had scholarship and stuff there too. But what the key point here is, we're going to talk about as we read through this, okay, what is kind of compelling here? What's the types of feedback that we provide? And we'll take a look at the final drafts of this. All right. So looking down, I saw the pieces of shredded pork starting to fall out of the gaping hole. The woman gawked at me from the other side of the food bar as I tried to think of an excuse. Her choice of fillings was awful. How could she expect me to wrap over 2 scoops of 3-cheese queso and shredded pork without at least half the filling squirting out? I'm new, I blurted, using the same excuse I had used at least 50 previous customers. I can see, she replied. An awkward silence followed. and I knew that I had to save her dead burrito. It was my second week at my summer job at Qdoba Mexican Grill, and my lumpy soggy burritos were a daily routine. I couldn't understand why I was struggling so much with making burritos when I was succeeding in a tough course load. I understood the first part of folding it like a dumpling, but rolling the burrito was a whole other story. No matter how hard I tried, the burrito would rip open, fall apart, squirt out liquid, or better yet, all three as the end result. It was horrendous. I used to cringe every time someone asked me for a burrito because I knew that the end result was not going to be pretty. This was my hardest burrito yet. Instead of freezing up and shoving the mess into another worker like I always did before, I forced myself to continue despite her angry glare. Quickly heating another tortilla, I transferred the contents to the lower half so I could save more room to roll over. After lifting the cover, I finally noticed the sogginess was coming from the pico de gallo and beans. After draining, I tried to make it quickly, but my heavy-handed pressure caused it to rip open. I tried again with gentle fingers, but it just fell apart. Taking a deep breath and with shaking hands, I tried another method, folding horizontally with firm pressure. To my delight, it stayed. Rolling the burrito, I wrapped the orange foil over and gave it to the customer, chiming, "Thank you, enjoy." I almost saw a hint of a smile across her face before she left. This was my proudest moment all year. Since the beginning, I dreaded how the burrito would decide to turn on me, but looking at the obstacle as a fun challenge helped me make a burrito I could actually serve to customers. It was in no ways perfect, but who can make a perfect burrito? Instead of thinking I couldn't do this because of potential problems, I changed my mindset to I will try my best, and if mistakes happen, that's just a natural part of the process. Just like the different burritos I have made, I will encounter many different challenges that I will need to adapt to. Even though the bigger challenges carry greater potential for mistakes, the reward is much greater, not just for me, but for other people. Sometimes the whole process is just as if not rewarding than the end product. Working for the answer is more enjoyable than having it automatically given to me. I never underestimate a potential challenge, no matter how small, because those may even be the hardest to stay focused on. I look at mistakes as opportunities to grow and find a better way. I look forward to challenges, big or small, that I will face in not just college, but life. Draining the distractions and little problems will help me overcome challenges more easily. How can I adjust my teaching so people understand what glomerulonephritis and projectile motion are? Where does the 8-mile Kensington bike path continue? Life is going to throw many more lumpy burritos at me, but I know what the next step will be. Okay. This is a really common, I mean, not about a burrito, but stylistically wise, of many examples of essays or many essays that students are actually submitting to colleges. All right. And the challenge that we have here is and drop in, by the way, into the chat, like, what are the traits that you kind of see here, right? And which of them are actually like you would consider strong? Please drop that in. But and then Debbie will shout some out. But the key point here is that a lot of students feel like they need to have a substantial amount of narrative and creativity within their writing. Okay, so they get the advice like, share your story. Okay, here's a nice story. It's kind of fun. Okay. I kind of get the sense that, okay, maybe this person's a bit of a problem solver, but it's just a burrito, right? That's about it. Okay. A lot of times we see this, which is this waxing philosophical in essays. So they're like, oh, I'll have many challenges, all of these types of things, and becoming a little bit of a philosopher about life. Okay. You're 17 or 18, probably don't have like these, these perspectives, right? And you're kind of just wasting word count to a large degree. And then like she gets into this stuff that's like, hey, how can I adjust my teaching to understand what glomerulonephritis? I'm like, what's that? That's kind of interesting, right? But nothing, right? And so a lot of times when you're reading these types of essays, or when admissions officers are reading essays, there's questions that pop into their mind. They're like, oh, that's kind of interesting, or like, oh, what's happening here? And then they just like those questions just go unanswered, like completely unanswered in the essay, like this. Okay. So now you have this essay, very typical, like lot of story, right? About one specific thing. Okay. Maybe one kind of interesting thing here. I'm also reading the beginning of the essay. I'm like, I don't know how this is relevant at all to what I care about. Okay. Whether or not the student will succeed at college or beyond. I start getting to that, like when you're like, oh, maybe she's actually going to be able to roll a burrito. Okay. I start kind of getting that sense by the time I get to like maybe the third paragraph. It's like, okay, maybe she's going to figure out how to do this. Great. Now, that's it. But as a reader, I'm like, I'm kind of losing interest towards the beginning. I'm like, this is just another essay, that's kind of like some nice, interesting writing, but I'm not really learning that much about the student. Okay. Debbie, what were the things that kind of came into the chat?
Initiative, drive, grit. A lot of people thought that it was too long. It was too long to get to the point.
Yeah. So making stuff more concise, really important. And then being able to fit in more content, really important. And the key thing here is like, you might see a little bit of initiative, but it's not that strong. You might see some solving of problems or intellectual, but it's not that strong. It's just a burrito. Okay. So let's take a look at kind of this near final version. I never got the final version from the student, but she said we can use this. Here we go. All right. The pieces of shredded pork started falling out of the gaping hole. The woman gawked at me from the other side of the counter. How could she expect me to wrap over 2 scoops of 3 cheese queso and shredded pork without at least half the squirting out? I'm new. I started for the 13th time that day. It was an excuse for my continued failure. I had been on the job at Qdoba Mexican Grill for 3 weeks, and my lumpy, soggy burritos were a daily humiliation. I couldn't understand why making a burrito was so hard when I had no trouble with calculus problems and memorizing hundreds of parts in anatomy. During wrapping, the burrito would rip open, fall apart, squirt out liquid. On the worst days, I fell victim to all 3. But at that moment, I mentally decided, that's it. I'm going to solve this problem and figure out how to wrap a burrito. I forced myself to continue despite the 2 glaring eyes that watched my every fold. Quickly heating another tortilla, I transferred the contents to the lower half so I could make more room to fold over. I noticed the sogginess was coming not from draining the beans and pico de gallo well enough, so I wiped off the excess moisture. Then I tried a different wrapping method, a horizontal fold. To my delight, it stayed. Rolling the burrito, I wrapped the orange foil over and gave it to the customer, chiming, "Thank you, enjoy." I almost saw a hint of a smile on her face before she left. After that day, I continued to find little improvements in my burrito making career and happily helped a new worker named Jasmine with properly positioning and smearing the guacamole and wrapping it over. From successfully making different burritos, I learned that persistence in studying the problem from different angles is the best approach to helping me improve. I thought I was just naturally good at calculus and anatomy, but even trying a different approach for calculus helps me solve the problems more efficiently. Efficiently. Anyone can learn anything as long as they set their mind to it. I now look at mistakes as opportunities to grow and find a better method. I look forward to future challenges that I might have to solve using different methods. Draining the little problems will help me more easily create a solution. As Health Occupations Students of America pathophysiology team leader, my responsibility is helping my team members learn about diseases and preparing them for competitions. I used to provide written notes from the book, but I saw that many of them struggle to understand glomerulonephritis because it is so different to other urinary diseases like nephritis. I decided to test new approaches to teaching the material. I matched pictures with diseases, made a polycystic kidney using bubble paper, and played a Be the Doctor game. I discovered that learning with written notes and memorization worked for me, but that interactive learning through games provided both my team members and me with a deeper understanding of the material. My strategy made an impact. My team scores went from 60 to 90% on quizzes, and 2 of my teammates placed as finalists at the state leadership conference. Burritos and Hosta taught me to look at problems from a different viewpoint and work together with others to achieve my goal. As a doctor, I may have to use different approaches to find an underlying problem. For example, I might have to use a cardiogram or Doppler cardiography just to find a tiny clot in the heart that could be affecting the whole body. I also need to work together with the patient to find the best treatment. Life is going to throw many more lumpy burritos at me, but I know how to approach each one. Okay, so this is still not the greatest essay ever, in my opinion. There's like a lot of opportunities to improve, but that's important, is because every student needs to be really confident in what they're submitting and what they want to submit. Number one, and then number two is like not every essay needs to be perfect and you can solve awesome outcomes. Okay, but this is why the content really matters. So what you notice here is all the burrito stuff is now way shorter, but it doesn't act like I've lost 0 content. Okay, but the word count is like half or less. All right, so that's one. Number two, I now have much clearer understanding of where this essay is headed. I know there's going to be maybe some stuff related to anatomy, some questions pop up, those get answered a little bit later. You also have, I decided I'm going to solve this problem, figure out how to wrap a burrito. I know what's coming, right? Some foreshadowing here. I also now get, and a lot of this is like due to the lines of questioning from like a coach or that sort of thing, is like, hey, did you actually what else did you do with the burritos? Like, now that you figured this out, did you help anybody else, right? And now she's able to show some contribution here. It's like, let me, just a few extra words, but like, hey, I actually helped this worker named Jasmine. That has a lot of impact on the reader, okay? Then this is the single most important line in the entire thing, okay? This wasn't even here before. And what this is the outcome of her impact, of what she did, okay? So as I'm reading this, I'm like, okay, this is kind of nice. Okay, I'm helping other people. Like I'm leading this thing, doing this written notes, blah, 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 right? Oh, I played the Be the Doctor game. Nice, right? Great. But guess what? Prove to me the impact. Her team scores went from 60 to 90%. So clearly what she did had a massive impact, okay? And 2 of her teammates were finalists at the state leadership conference. It's pretty clear that that probably wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for her and what she did. So she explained what she did and she talked about the impact of what she had, okay? Vast majority of students writing stuff are not doing this, okay? And so any sort of like quantitative or qualitative measure or some sort of sense of like, what was the outcome or the impact that this was can go a really long way. And then she even was able to tie it into some of her future goals. So now you can get a picture of, hey, I can actually see the student being successful on my campus. I can see what she's likely going to be doing on campus. And I can see what she's likely going to be maybe doing after she graduates, okay? And those are the types of things now within very few words, you can actually get a very strong understanding of this student, that she's probably going to be pretty successful, okay? And it's all because of these little things, a lot of times that are identifying stuff that like, and talking about it with the student or providing like the right types of lines of questioning so your student can actually identify what these things are, okay, and how to improve this. As I said, this is not like the greatest essay ever written, right? Yeah, the student probably even still had too much word count in the burrito stuff. She just had certain phrases that she really thought were clever, right? And wanted to keep them, right? Like this, right? During wrapping, the burrito would rip open, fall apart, squirt out liquid. On the worst days, I fell victim to all 3. It's like, okay, was that really necessary? I mean, it's kind of fun, but it's word count. But the key is like, she's able to kind of mix in like, here's the things that she wants to show from like a personality perspective and her voice perspective and telling these stories and integrating that with actually like really the stuff, the meat, the content that the admissions officers are looking for, okay? And so, other students would not even have the story, about the burrito, and that's totally fine, right? Because there's all sorts of other things that are compelling that people can write about. But the student was able to kind of integrate a lot of this different things together and have a lot of success, right? So just an example. All right. Debbie, were there any other questions that came in?
Well, this is like, yes,
Well,
there is like a general question, like can relate to this essay or anything that we spoke about tonight. How do admissions officers know that what the kids are writing about in their essays is the truth, or versus, they A, embellish, or B, lie?
the answer is there are sometimes hints, okay? And other times they just don't know, right? And so I think the thing here is that, number one, a lot of times like you can kind of tell when people are lying because like the details are not there specific enough, okay? Number one. Number 2 is like really hard for them to check stuff, right? Like how are they actually going to check whether or not somebody's telling the truth? Really hard. But a lot of times there's hints because maybe an activity or something else doesn't line up, or maybe a recommendation from an educator kind of doesn't line up with what they're with what they're talking about, right? So there's a lack of clarity sometimes. But yeah, I mean, there have been many situations, right, where students have figured out how to kind of lie their way into different things, right? But the key is like really focusing on like the student's voice, like what have they specifically accomplished, and getting to like the right types of lines of questioning to get the student to like really identify the extra things that they may not have even realized were that interesting or important, like helping Jasmine in this case, right, figure out how to roll a burrito. That's really useful for this, right? It provides a lot of context for like the type of person that the student is, but it's something that usually a student wouldn't be able to identify that they should be including on their own. Okay. So that's really important. And there was a question about like ChatGPT, AI, before. The answer there is like it writes a pretty good sounding essay, but the content and like the word patterns, like it's very fluffy sounding because it's using examples of other college essays kind of across the internet, which tend to be the types of essays that are focused less on content and the strength of having compelling content and more on like kind of the beauty of writing or like the types of this beautiful prose related to this mission trip that somebody took, for example. Okay. That's one. And then two is that we have found that the AI detection softwares that are out there. They're not great, but they tend to be better at picking up AI written college admissions essays because the pattern of those is so clear a lot of times. And so already you have schools like the University of California that use plagiarism detection softwares that they run all of the essays through, and I don't know if all the colleges are going to do this year, but some of them are going to definitely be looking at from like an AI detections perspective. But the key thing here is that the way, like, as I said, the content is what matters the most. Okay. And what you find is like if students are just like going in and having an AI write the essay like really quickly for them, usually the content is not very good. Okay, because it doesn't have enough context about what actually was happening or not happening or that sort of thing. And so the end product tends to be not very good, right? So it's like, like what a lot of times it's like what like a 6th or 7th grader would produce type situation, but it sounds really good a lot of times. It's just like when you actually like, if you're an admissions officer and you're reading this, you would be like, well, I'm not really picking up many of these 5 traits, or like they're not very strong, or like just missing a lot of things. And I've spent a lot of time with it. And so it can be a somewhat useful tool potentially for students, but there's a lot of risk in using it, I would say. And by the way, a lot of students are going to use it this year, and it's going to be an interesting result. But usually those are students that, if they do get into an institution and they used AI, it's because they probably had strong enough academics that the essay didn't matter that much for them. And I would highly doubt that students utilizing AI, unless it was like in a very more sophisticated manner, are going to get into like any of the highly selective schools. Okay. And there's ways to use it to write better stuff, but you really like need to focus on having like really good content first. And so that, I don't suggest that at all, to say the least.
So Brad, last question is just more of a tactical question. There were some people asking about these school packages. Do they include essays related to potentially like scholarships at the schools? So
it's anything related to that school's application. If it's a scholarship that's like an external scholarship and not related to those schools, it's not included. Okay. But the scholarships that are honestly the best ones to be applying to are the ones associated with schools anyways. Okay. Because those usually have if you're going to get accepted to school, you also have the better chances of getting those versus a lot of the independent scholarships are, 50,000 people applying for like 2, right? Or 1 of them, right? Or that sort of thing. So it's any written component of the application, including whatever's the scholarships for those schools. If there are any specific programs like honors colleges, a lot of schools might have like might have like a portfolio. Sometimes there's like an artist statement. Sometimes, it's a portfolio, like what's called like a maker portfolio. So somebody might be like, making different things and they have to write about it. And that's all included here, right? Additional information section, activities list. It's all the written components of the application. Yeah.
Great. That's helpful.
All right.
Okay.
I think that covers everything. As I said, you can go to the website, take a look at these. There's a lot more information there. It's completely risk-free. You can, get this, you can full refund if you're not satisfied after your first coaching session. We do that because everybody's very
Well, that
satisfied
actually was one other
with
question
it.
about,
Yeah.
are you assigned one coach?
Yes, you're assigned a coach to work with from beginning to the end of whatever you're working on. Okay. Together. And if for some reason you decide that's you and the coach are not as compatible as you would like it to be, we will give you a different one, but that is very rare. Because we do a very good job of selecting coaches for each student. Because the first thing you do is, before you even meet with a coach, is you talk with your student success manager, and you talk a little bit about kind of when you want to start, your different goals, that sort of thing. You have like a form that you fill out, and we're able to use that information to select a coach for you. And we're very good at matching coaches. And you can start kind of, if you wanted to you can get this now and then decide, hey, you want to have your students start in August, that's fine. Or you want them to start now, as we we're talking about with just kind of identifying the application plan. When we call like, hey, what's the content you're going to use across all your essays, and then start writing the essay later. Like, those are all kind of options that you have. It's not like you have to get started immediately with this, or if you have a vacation plan for the summer at some point, you can pause, we'll take that into consideration and kind of set the schedule kind of around these different things. We're very flexible, because and what's really awesome about this whole thing is we have a system, right? As you saw, like our entire software platform kind of manages all of this, right? And so that really kind of helps you and especially your student kind of stay on top of everything that needs to be done and accomplished, and helps us get the stuff done far earlier than they would typically do on their own.
And is there a limit to the number of times a student, like if they got one of the packages, is there a limit to the number of times?
I didn't mention it's unlimited, because we know, like, let's put it this way. So most students, like, let's say they're working on like their common application essay. They start with their coach with like an hour and a half call. They plan all their content. They get to an outline for their essay. Usually within that, they write their first draft. We get feedback on it, and usually they're done within 4 or 5 drafts of their essay. Okay. That's pretty typical. Some are a little less, some are a little more. Sometimes, we need extra coaching calls kind of along the way. But the key here is like, every single interaction that we have as coaches with your student, we want that to be extremely high value for them. So they may have homework to do a little bit beforehand that we'll have them do to just make those interactions and really kind of get them working on stuff. The feedback that we provide on their drafts are really detailed. You can see some examples of that online. And as I said, like our goal here is, and it is, it's unlimited, because like we are really good at making sure all those interactions are really high value. And what's awesome about working with us is that, you and your student are going to be very confident in the applications that you're submitting, but 2 is that you'll actually end up spending a lot less time. You and your student will actually end up spending a lot less time, because you're going to be doing this a lot smarter, right, than others, right? Because we kind of give you all the give your student kind of all the information and kind of walk them down the path to getting everything done, right, and done on time, rather than trying to find 50 different sources of information and try to figure out how to do this yourself, right? The time limit for the package is this application season. Okay, so usually
so whenever the last deadline is of the school.
Yeah, the last major deadline is like University of Michigan regular decision of like February 1st, typically. But most students, most students are wrapped up before then. A lot of the students that we work with, let's say they're working with just 3 applications, they're done before their senior year starts, or done very early into senior year. With those 3 applications. They're all schools. They have a lot of that work done ahead of time. And so that's, and just are kind of continuing to work during the semester on it. So no defined time. The other good thing that we have is that, we're not you know, we work over the holidays time frame.
That
So
does not, then nobody goes on a Christmas vacation at Prompt.
well, you know, people do take Christmas off, maybe, right? Not as many essays get done on Christmas Day,
Right.
but also less students are working on that day. But you know, we know that early January is a lot of deadlines for regular decision. So students are, you know, they have finals in December. They have a lot of stuff going on, and so we know that they're going to try. A lot of students want to wrap up those essays kind of over that holiday break, and our coaches are there to support that, right? Which I think is really important. You know, our busiest days of the year, it's you know, like you know, New Year's Eve is actually a pretty busy day for us, for example. So you know, and like December 30th, like October 30th,
October 30th, yeah.
is a huge, really busy day as people head into like November 1st deadlines. But you know, our goal is to kind of be here, right, for your students kind of as they're working. And you know, we pride ourselves. I think the average turnaround time if a student submits an essay to get feedback on it, the average is about it's like about 34 to 35 hours, I think it is. So usually less, you know, less than 2 days, and a lot, and near deadlines were even faster than that. Yeah. All right.
Great. Thank you, Brad.
Yeah. So you can always start with, you know, like 3 schools or just the common application. You can upgrade later. It might be a little bit more expensive than getting the discount right now. But we have a lot of families that, you know, choose to do that. So
a lot of questions about, yes, the recording will be sent tomorrow. If you want to watch it over with your student, which I recommend you do, that would be really helpful. So you'll get the link to the recording. A lot of what Brad talked about with these packages, we will send in a follow-up email. So you'll have that reference, and you can always go to the website, myprompt.com/road to college.
Yeah,
all there.
Yep. So you can do that. And then also, if you have any specific questions for me, you can just reach out to me at brad@myprompt.com. Pretty responsive, or I might pass it over to somebody else sometimes. And as I said, if you want to set up a time for one of our team members to call you, you can also do that from the myprompt.com/road to college site. And so you can select the time and we'll call you. Okay. Talk about your situation. This has been wonderful. As always, Debbie, we have so much fun on these. And, you know, I saw, you know, it's always fun kind of seeing everybody on the video and some nodding along. And some people are like, you know, falling asleep during a couple of the different sessions. Maybe we'll have to spend a little less time on a couple things, but other people are engaged. So I guess it just depends. So, all right. Very good.
Thank you, everyone.